Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. So what I want to look at today is how countries have typically responded to demographic decline and how they've used migration within that context to support their response to demographic declines. And it's a particularly important topic globally, as we're seeing, as was mentioned in the last presentation as well. A number of countries are going to be facing significant challenges. You had that number of 10 million for Germany over the next 10 years. I was just reading an article saying that Germany needs 500,000 migrant workers a year over the next 10 years as well. So it's an issue for many countries, but particularly for this region of Central and Eastern Europe, where 16 of the 20 countries that are projected to face the largest demographic declines are in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And now, why is this? There are a variety of reasons for demographic declines. The first is high rates of immigration, which occur not over a single span, but over several decades, meaning that you've got people who have left the country several decades ago and are now raising families and having children in other countries, which is not contributing to onward next generation growth within the country of origin. But then you're also facing existing emigration of youth as well. So it creates a sort of double effect on impacting the decline of the demographics in the country. Another one is obviously low fertility rates. So throughout the region globally, but particularly throughout this region, we've seen declines in fertility rates over the past few decades, which contribute to obviously lower demographics. And then another issue, which is not particularly relevant for this region in particular, are higher death rates, which might occur due to natural disasters, wars, etc. So if we're looking at the case of Syria, for example, or other war-torn countries where high death rates for specific reasons might have occurred, natural disasters such as earthquake in Haiti, for example, or even on a global level now, looking at the impacts of COVID-19, increasing death rates within specific countries. And what we find is in this region in particular, it's a combination of effects of low fertility and high rates of emigration that contribute to this. So countries like Korea and Japan, for example, which are normally seen as very aging populations, as the most advanced countries dealing with aging populations, don't factor in because they have incredibly low fertility rates, but they don't have the same level of emigration rates that other countries do, meaning that the population as a whole isn't quite as affected. Now, why is this important? I think the previous speaker in answering one of the questions already highlighted some of the key points to this. Some would say that this isn't really an issue. Some environmentalists might say that depopulation is a way of addressing negative environmental impacts of human activity. With fewer people comes less human activity. But regardless of your position on this, I think that there's no denying that population change, if occurring quite suddenly, quite abruptly, and without sufficient foresight or governance, will have massive disruption effects with negative consequences to certain segments of the population in particular. In terms of problems for government, we'll see higher dependency ratios, meaning lower revenue for government. With fewer workers in the labor force comes less income tax, for example, which means there's less funding going into government coffers on income tax. And there's higher expenditures for government as well. Whereas education, there might not be as much investment in education simply because there are fewer students within the system. You will see higher demand for social security, retirement benefits that might be publicly offered, as well as increases in the needs for healthcare services, for example, which require greater expenditures from governments at the same time that they're seeing reduced money coming in the form of income taxes, for example. So public finances can be severely stretched by shifts in demographics, and particularly when populations are declining. There's also a need to look at more, a more detailed government planning in terms of how spending is allocated. Funding allocation for government services, how much goes towards education versus how much then goes towards healthcare, senior services, etc. There needs to be a rethinking and a reallocation of where government gets involved and the extent to which budgets are put towards these different things. There's also a need to look at the labor market. So how does this impact the labor market, and how do these shortages in labor market in particular occupations, how are these going to be addressed? And then finally, looking at a more broadly at socioeconomic development strategies. For decades now, governments have been putting in place social and economic development strategies that expect a certain level of population growth. And now having to shift that to deal with anticipated declines in population requires a serious rethink of how we interpret and how we design socioeconomic development strategies. Now, who is impacted when we're looking at demographic change? Because what's important to note is that even though we tend to record populations on a national level, that doesn't mean the country as a whole is impacted in the same way. There can be, and there are, large disparities between different regions in a country in terms of how they're impacted by this. And it creates a different set of priorities depending upon what level of government you're talking to. So I recall being in a conference where the mayor of Tirana in Albania was speaking, and everyone was asking the mayor about labor shortages and particularly brain drain, which baffled him because he's dealing with workers coming into his city on a daily basis. He said he's getting, 30,000 extra people a year coming into his labor market. He has highly skilled workers coming into his labor market. So he's looking at how he can create employment for people, not worried about demographic decline. So it's very different if you're looking at it from a municipal level than when you're looking at it from a national level. And we find in particular that rural regions and secondary cities, so smaller cities, are the most impacted by demographic decline. For obvious reasons, they're impacted both by international migration, but also internal, mainly rural to urban migration, where particularly youth tend to move to the larger cities in the country. And this creates challenges in regards to access to essential services within the smaller communities and smaller communities within the country. And what's important to note as well is that it's often the least mobile populations who are the most vulnerable due to these demographic changes. So it's primarily the elderly and lower educated persons who might not have the opportunities to migrate that remain in these communities and remain vulnerable to the types of challenges that they face within demographics. The ones that are least affected, as I said, are the major cities in a country, because they do tend to benefit from internal migration that offsets any sort of international migration they see leaving their city. So in Bulgaria, for example, where the population has declined by 20% since 1990, over the same period of time, the population of Sofia has increased by 7%. So Sofia hasn't seen that impact that has really impacted other parts of the country. And if we look at a less extreme example of Slovakia, in the table there, we can see that the population of Slovakia has actually increased by about 1% over the past 10 years, but that growth is very divergent. So the vast majority of the growth happened within two cities, in Bratislava and Prešov, whereas other parts of the country have already started to see certain amounts of decline in their populations. Now, how do countries typically react to these types of changes that they see? First of all, and I think was noted by the IOE participant in the first presentation of today as well, is that the reaction is often first triggered by the private sector or by investors, because they're the ones that are most directly impacted by this. Once they start to see labor market shortages, once they're struggling to find workers for positions, they start to raise alarm bells with the government. It can also obviously come from citizens themselves, particularly in rural communities. When they start to face challenges accessing basic services, lack of doctors, lack of healthcare services, etc., can be brought to the attention of the government. Now, how do countries react? One of the first reactions we usually see is the development of policies to promote redistribution of the population. So looking at promoting internal migration away from the large cities towards smaller cities and smaller communities. Because the effects, as I said, are not felt on a national basis, this sort of redistribution internally is seen as an ideal way of addressing these challenges. And there are a variety of ways that countries can do this. Sorry, I just put this up. This was supposed to go with the first bullet, looking at Slovakia's worker shortage and the threats to the growth of the auto industry because of that. Again, this is something that foreign investors and companies have raised alarms about. But going to internal sort of redistribution of populations, governments put in place a variety of different strategies, so tax benefits or housing benefits or some sort of financial incentives to motivate particularly younger people, young professionals to move from the larger cities towards smaller communities. And they can also do this with employers, trying to get employers to redirect their investments and their job creation away from the major cities and towards smaller cities throughout the country. Japan, there's an article from Japan noting precisely this phenomenon where the government is trying to put in place systems to address the vanishing rural towns, as they say. Another option is capital investments to increase productivity, which I think we've all seen as well. The classic example of the automated McDonald's teller now is a direct result of the company having trouble finding a sufficient number of workers to work in their restaurants. So we see increased automation, not only in manufacturing, but increasingly in the service industry as well. Another option tried by many governments is to obviously increase fertility rates. And we've seen a variety of incentives that are usually designed to offset the costs of raising a child. But the effects of these policies are often there often is no effect, or the effects are very minimal, because what we see is that while cost may play a factor in how many children a couple has, or if they have a child at all, it's not the main factor. There are certain lifestyle considerations, meaning that regardless of the finances, most couples are not interested in taking on having a larger family. But that doesn't stop governments from trying some very creative ways of trying to increase the fertility rate. Denmark had a very interesting campaign once where this was a few years ago. They were subsidizing vacations for couples in the hope that going to a romantic city would increase fertility rates among young couples. Another option is increasing the retirement age. This tends to be, this happens incrementally over time. We've seen this not just in the UN agencies, but in a number of countries, slowly increasing the retirement age. It's not a politically popular move, though, so governments are reluctant to do this. And finally, the final reaction that we'll see from countries to address these demographic shifts is migration policy. Winston Churchill once said, America will always do the right thing once it's exhausted every single option. And I think something similar is true for countries dealing with demographic change. They will eventually address issues of immigration once they've exhausted every possible option they have in terms of how to address the problem. So just to give you, sorry, before I do that, maybe we can go to the last Slido just to keep you all awake. Another survey for you to fill out the final question. So the question is now specifically to Slovakia, how is the population of Slovakia projected to grow by 2050? Will it increase by 4%, increase by 2%, stay flat, decrease by 4%, or decrease by 8%? Interesting. Okay. Okay, so most people are predicting it to either stay flat or decrease. Okay. It's very evenly spread. So I think it's interesting to see that there isn't a whole lot of consensus on this issue. But the correct answer is actually that it's projected to decrease by 8%. So it's actually quite a considerable decrease of population that's anticipated for Slovakia over the next three decades. Obviously, this can change depending upon a variety of factors, but as the previous speaker pointed out, policy has an important impact. So what policies the government puts in place to address these types of demographic changes will have a significant impact on how great the decrease will be. But going back to the presentation now, there we go. Just to give you a sense of how demographic projections look for this region and how different it is to the broader global projections. The one you see increasing is the projected population growth for the world at large. So over the next 30 years, they're projecting a roughly 22% increase in global population. For the countries in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, we're seeing either slight or significant declines in population over the same period. So the Czech Republic, for example, is projected to see about a 3% decline in population. And then that varies all the way down to Bulgaria, which is projected to see a 20% decline in population over this period. So this region, I think, is quite unique in the types of demographic changes that are expected to occur over the next few decades, particularly when we compare it to what's expected to happen in other parts of the world. Now, looking specifically at how countries use immigration to address these problems or to address the issue of demographic decline, once they've acknowledge that migration is a part of the solution. We find that there's usually, not always, but usually a sort of phased approach in how they're willing to use migration to respond to demographic issues. The first is simply in promoting return migration of immigrants and diaspora population. So many countries that have experienced demographic decline have done so because of emigration in previous generations, and they then call on those migrants or their descendants to return to the country of origin. One of the first examples of this was Japan, who called on what's known as the Dekasegi population, which was Japanese who had emigrated to Brazil and to mainly South America many generations before, and they brought back, say, second, third, or even fourth generations to come work in Japan in the hundreds of thousands. And this is something that we see also common in certain countries in the Eastern EU as well as beyond. However, there's a limit to the interest of people to return and a limit to the numbers of those who can return. So a next phase we see countries starting to engage in is to open up for temporary labor migration programs, usually looking to neighboring countries or countries that they consider culturally similar, due to concerns about the social dynamics of immigration and integration. And here we see again the case of Japan, which has just in the past few years really started to opening their doors to temporary labor migration, working with, I think it's 15 different partner countries that they've selected specifically because they see them as sort of, for lack of a better term, more socially acceptable to the general public of Japan. I think I've got, and if we look at migration that's gone into Eastern EU countries from other Eastern EU countries over the past few years, we see very similar tendencies where it's primarily neighboring countries or countries within the Eastern European region that are becoming major source countries for migrants for countries that are in need of workers, such as the large one being Poland that we've seen major growth in, but other countries including the Czech Republic, Hungary, etc. The next phase would be for countries to open their doors to more permanent migration. So shifting from looking at temporary solutions with 2-year or 3-year or 4-year programs for labor migration to open up to more permanent migration. And this usually occurs initially, at least primarily for high-skilled migrants. And at the same time, they expand the countries of origin that they're looking at. So instead of looking at select countries that they think that are culturally similar, we see sort of an expansion to look into other countries as sources. And then the final phase, we would see countries starting to open their doors for opportunities for permanent migration paths, even for lower skilled migrants. And we see this in, for example, countries like Canada and the United States, a number of Western EU countries as well, that are starting to create more regular permanent pathways for migration for lower skilled workers. But if we look at, I mean, I could give plenty of examples, but we can look at Western EU countries, Japan, Korea, the Gulf countries, and they've all followed sort of similar trajectory in terms of how they open up their labor market and how they open up their immigration policy to this. And they're at different stages in this process. I would say that Japan is probably at stage 2. The Gulf countries have probably reached stage 3. They're not so keen on opening to permanent migration, but they have expanded to other countries of origin in the 70s, first starting only with Arab countries, then in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, increasingly looking to Southern Asia, Southeastern Asia, and now we see significant growth of African migrant workers in the Gulf countries as well. So you see this sort of gradual expansion of the types of countries that they're willing to engage with on labor migration. And in the EU as well, for example, you saw the development of the blue card many years ago as a sort of step of going to phase 3 and looking at permanent migration for high-skilled workers. Now, in an ideal world, countries with surplus labor, where we know there are large youth populations and high rates of unemployment, and the economy simply can't develop enough jobs to meet the demand, the new supply of workers coming into the labor market. In an ideal world, those countries would be matched with countries facing labor shortages. And then we could develop what we're looking at now, sort of skills partnerships that would promote regular migration channels so that we could have ideally supply and demand balancing out between countries with surplus labor and countries with demand for labor. And that would involve, for example, looking at current demographics, opening up to countries primarily in Africa and Southeast Asia that have very young populations. And have a clear interest in working in Europe, for example, or other main countries of destination. And we are starting to see some of this, as the participant from the IOE mentioned. There is a growth in interest in these types of skills partnerships that try to better match skills and training in countries of origin with the demands of countries of destination. But we're far from being where we want to be on that. Because reality, as we all know, is decidedly messier than what we see in an ideal world. And the reason, well, there are a number of reasons for this, but I think the biggest challenge when it comes to migration is that, first of all, there are a number of factors to take into account. But secondly, there are a number of different stakeholders with differing levels of interest or different types of interest. You've got communities within the destination country who have their own interests. You have governments who have particular interests in where they want to seek workers from, et cetera. But most importantly, you've got the private sector. The private sector is the one that's going to be employing these workers after all. And they have particular interests in the types of workers they want to bring in and how they want to bring these workers in. So when an employer, a typical employer, looks at bringing in workers because they need workers, they don't look at which countries have a surplus of labor. They simply look at which countries have a sufficient number of workers with the right skills who are willing to work for them at a given salary. And also they're looking at how easy or difficult it is to bring those workers in from those countries. And it's very rare that countries that have this surplus labor, as I mentioned, actually have those types of systems and those types of skills in place that meet employer demands within main countries of destination. So what we see instead is that employers are pulling from countries that themselves don't have a surplus of workers in those occupations. And then when we get, that's why I put the picture on the top right of this, is a sort of domino effect where one country is recruiting from another country, which then faces labor shortages in that occupation and then has to seek workers from yet another country to bring in to meet those shortages as well. And we create a sort of domino effect of labor migration from one country to another. But as I said, there are a number of reasons for this beyond employer interests. There are cultural, social, and historical biases towards specific countries of origin. Countries are more open to opening up their labor markets to some countries rather than others. There are factors, as I said, making certain countries of origin more attractive for employers to recruit. If there's a more developed recruitment industry, for example, in the Philippines, it's much easier to recruit a worker from the Philippines than it is from Nigeria, for example. So obviously, employers are more incentivized to seek workers from the Philippines. And finally, there's a lack of a whole of government approach. And this has to do with how we see immigration in the first place, whether we're looking at it from a security angle or whether we're looking at it from an economic development angle. And very often in countries of destination, the two sides aren't speaking much with one another. So we don't have a whole of government approach. And we spend significant amounts of money on defending our borders and engaging in deportations or voluntary return of people who are coming to the country. And at the same time, we're spending additional millions of dollars trying to attract other types of workers from other countries. And there hasn't been much effort in the past, at least, to see how things can be synergized. There's never going to be a perfect fit, but surely there are synergies that can happen that reduce this type of dual approach to immigration. Now, I know I'm running short on time, so I'll try to go quickly. What are the risks of having an overly restrictive policies? So even when governments do open up to labor migration as a solution, often we find that there are policies that are put in place that simply make it difficult for it to actually happen in practice. So developing overly complex, long processes for employers to bring in needed workers means that these systems aren't going to be functioning for the end users, which are employers and migrants. If this is the case, you can see decline of investment, especially in foreign direct investment, because one of the things that employers are going to be looking for is, can I get the workforce I need into place easily, either through national workers or through foreign workers in order to meet my needs? You'll find growth of irregular migration and employment to meet demand, as was mentioned by the representative from the IOE, with the example of using, needing a chef, but putting them in as a waiter, because you can get waiters in and not chefs. You'll find misuse of programs and irregular migration. And you'll find increased segregation and lack of integration due to unwelcoming policy approaches. So you'll find that migrant communities that do exist either irregularly or regularly in your country become increasingly segregated, which creates social challenges. but there are risks of having an overly open policy as well. So what are some of the challenges we see there? We see rapid growth of migrant worker populations and recruitment industries can create very strong lobbies for recruitment agencies themselves. And you see countries where recruitment agencies have become, or the recruitment industry has become so important for the economy that they actually play an outsized role in policy development, which of course creates its own challenges. If there's an overly open policy, you can find lack of investment in technology and productivity growth. If it's easy to bring in workers for somewhat lower salaries, then you're going to find that employers are going to go for that option instead of looking at other opportunities such as investment in technology or other forms of productivity growth to increase their growth. There are limited resources and services to provide effective oversight of programs. So if programs grow rapidly, often governments don't put in place the types of oversight that they need to make sure that there isn't exploitation at the recruitment level or at the employment level. There's a growing risk of worker exploitation in recruitment and employment. As I said, if you don't put in the resources for oversight, you will find growing exploitation. And finally, there's growing possibility of growing xenophobia and social tensions in response to rapid growth of foreign populations. I don't know how well you can see this example, but the top graph looks at this is looking at the Brexit votes by communities in the UK. And I know Brexit was about more than just immigration policy, but it was a large part of it. And what they find is the top one is looking at the percentage of the foreign population in a community, and then looking at whether they voted largely remain or leave. The bottom one is not looking at the size of the migrant population, but how quickly that population has grown over the past few years. And what we find is that populations where there isn't that many migrants, but the migrant population has grown quite rapidly in recent years, you find that they have been more likely to vote to leave the EU and are more negative towards immigration issues in general. So rapid growth of the population can create backlash among society as well, if not governed effectively. So what do we need to do to get it right, or to get close to right at least? First of all, it's critical to make sure that you're anticipating labor market needs at the national and regional levels. And there I would echo what my colleague in the IOE was mentioning about the need to bring in employers so that you can understand what their needs are within the labor market. They're really the key tool to really understand what's going on within the labor market. There's a need for a holistic approach. Migration is not the only tool in the toolbox, but we need to look at how migration is included within the policy mix to respond to occupational labor shortages that are going to occur within demographic declines. There's a need to understand and invest in skills qualifications equivalencies, to understand how you match the skills and qualifications and training in one country with what's needed in another. And this is what's been spoken about by previous presentations on global skills partnerships and the need to invest in this. And there's a need for targeted policies, looking at who gets in what numbers, in which sectors, and in which regions. You really need targeted policies that respond to the labor market needs that you see in your country. And that's where the previous presenter spoke about point systems. That's where point systems can really be a challenge. In recruitment programming, getting it right means needing to understand that your system is not the only game in town. It is in competition with irregular employment. If you're not providing the right systems or programs to allow employers to bring in the workers that are actually needed, then other workarounds are going to be found, if not through gaming the system, then simply bypassing the system. So irregular migration is almost always an option, and a regular system is in competition with that. So you need to make sure that it's user friendly, essentially, and understand the process from the end user perspective. And this is important because often governments, because there are so many different ministries and agencies involved in international migration, and labor migration, no one has a perspective from the end user side, and they don't realize that how cumbersome and how long the entire process can take, which obviously reduces its competitiveness. There's a need to ensure sufficient resources across the recruitment cycle. As I said, different groups are involved. So it requires Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it requires Ministry of Labor, et cetera. And if you don't have, for example, the resources within the consular services of a given country to process the amount of work permits or visas that are coming, that creates a bottleneck which can add months to the process and then makes it uncompetitive for employers to engage in. And finally, there's a need to provide oversight and complaints mechanisms for migrant workers to address the issues that you're going to face with exploitation. I have 2 slides left. Let's see if I can get through them. On the social cohesion side of things, different services are required depending on immigration policies that are in place. So you need to make sure that you're developing the types of services and programs for migrants' integration that aligns with the types of immigration policies that you have in place. The types of programs that you need for temporary workers in terms of their protection, in terms of their integration within the workforce, will be very different from the types of services that you need if you're looking at longer term immigration of people, including family resettlement, et cetera. There's a need to work with employers to promote safety and social cohesion in the workplace and address issues of geographic and social segregation that may develop. And here it's critical to be working with the local municipalities, because that's where we start to see the tensions, and that's where we start to see the best solutions and instruments to deal with the types of social tensions that you see in communities. So there's a need to engage with local communities to a significant level, particularly when we're looking at social integration of migrants. Okay, so on to the conclusions with my 30 seconds left. Demographic changes in Eastern Europe require a variety of policy responses. So my presentation isn't meant to promote labor migration as the solution, but we do need to see immigration policy as one of the many levers that needs to be used in order to address the types of challenges that countries are going to face. And too often in the past, we've seen that governments try every lever before they try migration, and then once migration is brought into the mix, it's done hastily, and we face challenges either with policies that are too restrictive or too open. So getting the balance right has been a challenge. Most countries facing demographic transitions, as I said, are slow to respond with adequate changes to their immigration policy. Labor migration policies should fit within broader labor market development strategies. So this needs to be looked at as one tool within a mix of tools that countries are going to be using to address these demographic changes. And then finally, immigration policies need to be considered from the social dynamics in communities as well. You're not just bringing in workers, you're bringing in people with different social dynamic effects on the community. And for that reason, we really need to work closely with local governments to make sure that that integration is done effectively. Thank you.